Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is State of the U.S. Energy Storage Industry 2020 Year in Review. This webinar is being presented by the DOE OE Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance. Before we get started with our main presentations today, I'd like to go over a few very quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in via telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there on your screen. You can also click on that arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you may like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. We'll be saving plenty of time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We'd love to get to as many questions as we can, so please do type your questions and comments in as you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording. It'll get to you within the next 24 or so hours, and we'll also be posting it on the CISA website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a Senior Project Director at the Clean Energy States Alliance. Todd?
Thanks, Samantha. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. I don't know how many years at this point we've been doing these, but this is our annual sort of summary and look back at the year in energy storage. Have some excellent speakers, and we will have plenty of time for questions. So I'm just going to do a brief intro to give everyone a little information about Clean Energy States Alliance and the STAP program, and then we will move right into the main presentations. So Clean Energy States Alliance, CISA, is a nonprofit membership organization of state clean energy funds. You can see the logos of the membership on the slide. And Samantha, if you could just advance this for me, that'd be great. CISA does support state energy agencies and all kinds of clean energy policy programs and deployment. We do research, we do lots of webinars and publish reports. And among the many things that we do is the STAP program, which stands for Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership. This is a program we conduct under contract with Sandia National Laboratories. It's funded by US DOE Office of Electricity. And primarily, we work to help put together joint federal state energy storage deployment projects, usually large-scale projects. And you can see on the map a number of those that we've recently been working on are indicated all over the country. And we also help to disseminate information about energy storage in webinars such as this one, and conference presentations and other venues. And we do other things, such as reporting on some of these projects. All of our reports and webinars are archived on our website and can be viewed at any time. Next slide, please. And we also do some support for state policy and regulatory work around energy storage. Before we get to our speakers for today, I wanted to thank Dr. Imre Gyuk, who is with us today and will be speaking next. He's the Director of Energy Storage Research at the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity. And Dan Borneo, I don't believe he's with us today, but he is the Engineering Project and Program Lead for Sandia National Laboratories. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers, and I'm going to keep this very brief as we got a little delayed due to some technical difficulties. I already introduced Dr. Gyuk, Director, Energy Storage Research, US DOE Office of Electricity. Dr. Gyuk has been a leader in energy storage work for many years and is instrumental in pushing energy storage into new technologies, new applications, and new economics and business models. We also will hear from Dan Finn-Foley, Head of Energy Storage at Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. And Dan is also a long-time collaborator. He's spoken on many prior webinars, and we appreciate his being with us today. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Dr. Gyuk for some introductory remarks. I want to remind listeners that we will address as many questions as we can after the presentations. So please type those into the question console as they occur to you, and that gives me time to sort through them and we can address them more efficiently. Thanks very much, and I'll pass the baton to Dr. Gyuk.
Hello. It's nice to be with STAP again. And today, our old friend Dan Finn-Foley is going to do his celebrated review of the year 2020 in energy storage. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to look in the opposite direction. I'm going to try and see what is looming ahead. Next, please. So, I've called this Things That Matter. And I'm going to run through a few issues that I think are of paramount importance now and in the future. One is surviving the COVID pandemic. Now, the energy storage industry has done quite well, surprisingly so. Installations are higher than ever, and Dan is going to give you more details. And in the US, I think we are well on the way of being in control with vaccinations and hopefully people continuing to socially distance and wear masks and all those things. But what about the rest of the world? If we are going to get this off our back, and if energy storage is going to work all over the place, we will have to take care of places like Africa and other countries that do not have vaccination projects of their own. So the COVID pandemic is far from over. We have an entire world to vaccinate and to make safe. Next. Safety issues. Well, we have good storage technologies, but unfortunately, whenever you think you're safe, things happen. We've had fires in Korea, we've had the Arizona event, and more recently, we've had Liverpool. These things cannot just be shoved under the carpet. We have to address them. We have to have safe technology. This is also true if we go towards the future with perhaps other technologies than lithium-ion. We have to worry about toxic materials. We have to worry about spills that may pollute the water table, the water courses, or ultimately air pollution. If we're going to do hydrogen, for example, we have to really worry about seepage of hydrogen into the air. These are serious problems, and with the magnitude of storage that we have ahead of us, it's something we have to consider seriously. Next, please. In the US, and for that matter elsewhere too, domestic manufacturing. There is a danger in relying on technology coming from certain areas and being entirely reliant on that stream of products. In the US, we need to develop domestic manufacturing. And for that matter, so does Europe, and so do other countries. Next, please. Domestic manufacturing also goes with a regional supply chain. We cannot rely for lithium and cobalt and what have you, nickel, on just a few countries. We have to have material security for the US and, for that matter, for Europe and other countries. The supply chain is important, and it should not be controlled by just a few countries. Next, please. We need a circular economy for energy storage. Recycling and reuse have to become a reality. We do not have that at the moment. With lithium ion, the dominant technology nowadays, and the dominant technology for at least the next 5 or 10 years, we have not really resolved that. And it's got to be an economical recycling. We can recycle things, but we have to be able to do it routinely and economically. Lead-acid batteries already have that. We need to be able to do that for lithium ion and for any future technology that we might be using. Next, please. This is new, but it's really an old problem. Social equity. As we deploy technology, it tends to go more and more towards the more affluent part of society. We cannot afford that. We have to assure social equity, and energy storage can help with that. I have made social equity an initiative at our program at the Department of Energy, and we are going to start with a workshop at DOE sometime in April. Look out for it. There should be some very interesting issues coming out. Next, please. And of course, for the future, we will need long duration storage. As we reach higher and higher penetration of renewables, long duration storage will become essential. We have to go from 6 to 8 hours, which we can handle with lithium ion, to 10 hours, to diurnal, to several days, and possibly weeks and even months. In order to do that, we will need new technologies and new approaches where we don't just do energy storage per se, but we fold in other approaches such as demand management. We will be holding a workshop on long duration storage, which again is an initiative in our program at the Department of Energy, and the workshop will be for free this is 9th and 10th, not 5th and 10th, the glitch. So look out for it, March 9th and 10th. Next, please. So 100% decarbonization by 2050. An increasing number of states have put it down as a legal mandate. Are we going to reach it? Energy storage is going to play a fundamental role. And we will have to look towards new solutions and new approaches if it's actually going to happen. We are going to have to work very hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Imre. That's quite a list of goals, and I think that it's very, very important. I'm glad to see that that the social equity and long duration initiatives are getting underway. That's fantastic. We will, if it's appropriate and you want to do this, we can provide more information about those down the road as they come into focus for folks who might want to learn more.
That
so
will
we will now
certainly be
go.
desirable.
Good, great. So now we're going to turn to Dan Finn-Foley, who's going to speak to us about the current status of energy storage and where we're headed, where we've been in the past year, and where we're headed now. Dan?
Thank you so much, Todd. It's always interesting to follow you, Dr. Cook, because you have such great perspective for what's going to be happening next and the necessities surrounding energy storage, the complexities of the next steps as well. Let me dive in here. So quickly, my name is Dan Finn-Foley. I'm the head of energy storage with Wood Mackenzie Power Renewables. Yeah, excited to be here with the Clean Energy States Alliance, all the great work that you're doing there. Really delighted to be here and really looking forward to being in and talking some more about what we're seeing in terms of the energy storage industry right now. So let's fire away. Let me make sure that I've got the control of the screen here. Perfect. All right. So once again, my name is Dan Finn-Foley, head of Wood Mackenzie. Head of Wood Mackenzie's Energy Storage Research Group. Always delighted to join these webinars with the Clean Energy States Group and try to create an impression of sort of what we're seeing in the market, what's been happening and where we're moving going forward. A little context, if you're not familiar with Wood Mackenzie is a global research and consultancy in the energy space. Our group, the Energy Transition Practice, was formed out of the Power and Renewables Group, the acquisition of Green Tech Media, where I was initially on the energy storage team there, make consult on the wind energy side. And now we have sort of a comprehensive view of the energy ecosystem globally. So my specialty is stationary storage, and that's what my team focuses on here. Let's dig in. So digging in very quickly into what we're seeing in the energy storage market. I love pulling up this slide on quarterly deployments just because it really shows the scale of what we've been seeing, and it tells the story of the market in a way that I think is insightful if you're really aware of what the market's been doing in the past, but also gives you a real look at what the market has been like if you're not very familiar with it. And so digging in here, what you're actually seeing here is a series of policies, regulations, market opportunities that have flourished and faded over the past several quarters that are going to, or the past several years, I should say, that are going to accelerate. And in 2020, we've hit absolutely new records. We have information out to Q3 2020 here. We have preliminary Q4 2020 numbers that are being finalized right now and will be published as part of our next energy storage monitor released on March 3rd. So digging in here, the sort of story that this tells, if you're not familiar with the storage market in the US, the first thing that we have was a real big boom surrounding the PJM frequency regulation market. These were relatively shorter duration systems that were installed in 2014, 2015, 2016, to a lesser extent, before that market became a bit saturated and dried up. Then around 2016, 2017, we had a real turning point in the market around the Aliso Canyon natural gas leak, where an expedited procurement was put in place to actually or potentially fill in for potential natural gas, which was not going to be available for peak power applications in California. That's a quick boom that you see there at the end of 2016 to 2017. And then we started to scale up into more consistent deployments. The residential market surged, the non-residential market grew as well. But then front of the meter deployments continued to grow relatively dramatically. There were relatively staggered deployments, and a single project moving from quarter to quarter can swing things one direction or another. But you can see here that Q3 2020 really did change the entire y-axis of this graphic, rocketing up to almost 500 megawatts deployed in a single quarter. And I can tell you that the y-axis is going to be adjusted again for Q4. It's going to be another record-setting quarter, and 2020 in general is going to be a record-setting year. Some amazing statistics surrounding 2020 that are still preliminary is that there may be more deployed in 2020 than in all of the years 2013 or maybe 2015 through 2019 combined. So it really shows the scale of the acceleration of this market, which is incredibly exciting. If you're in the energy storage business, always make sure that you get paid by the slide, as for every megawatt chart that you make, you're going to have to do a megawatt hour chart to provide visualization on what the duration is for energy storage. And this is where you can start seeing even more nuance into the market, where we have those PJM projects in 2014, 2015, shorter duration, really not creating as much of a splash in the megawatt hour section. And then the Aliso Canyon procurement projects, most of them around 4 hours. That spike is much more real. Then throughout the rest of the time period moving forward, we do have a lot of deployments surging up, residential, non-residential, of course, being a big factor. 2020 was not as dramatic in terms of megawatt hours because there was a bit of a resurgence in 1 hour systems. Some of the large scale systems that we saw, for instance, the 250 megawatt gateway system for now is a 1 hour system. Many of the projects that were installed in Texas, maybe 100 megawatts, and I would love to come back to talk about Texas later on in the presentation as well, were 1 hour systems as well. So it was a real trend that happened in 2020 and did mute the effects of the sort of megawatt hours versus the megawatt applications that we saw. Oops. Sorry about that. So quickly talking about some of the drivers that we're seeing here. One of the biggest ones that I really wanted to highlight was the role of utilities and integrated resource plans in regulated markets. We're actually tracking all of this as part of our integrated resource plan tracker. And what we're seeing is that utilities are investing in energy storage in ways that are incredibly dramatic right now. This is not just a red state or a blue state situation anymore. We have utilities looking at energy storage as a resource throughout the Pacific Northwest, throughout the rest of the Southwest, even in Texas, in El Paso Electric's territory just outside of ERCOT, throughout the Southeast. And then storage is also getting massive amounts of interest in potentially the regulated, deregulated markets as well, where we're seeing massive investment in interconnection queue requests from Texas, SPP, MISO. In PJM, big news out of PJM, of course, they may be changing the way that they value capacity in the capacity market. New York ISO, ISO New England, there's been tons of interest across these markets, but regulated utilities are going to be a massive opportunity for storage moving forward. For instance, in 2021, what we're looking at in terms of our forecast involves 770 megawatts of energy storage, much of it solar paired, in SCE's territory alone as part of a single procurement. So that sort of tells you the kind of scale that we're going to be seeing moving forward, which is incredibly exciting. Really, the way that utilities are valuing energy storage is a massive factor in terms of not just what we're looking at for the future, but what we've looked at for the past. Utilities previously, when they model energy storage, it's a relatively new technology. And in particular, energy storage as a 4 hour more quote unquote capacity asset is relatively new as well. In that case, utilities have been learning about how to value it, how to model it right along with the rest of the industry. So that's an incredibly big deal that they've had to adapt to this, and maybe counter to some of the jokes made about utilities. They're these sort of hulking dinosaurs who don't adapt very quickly. I think that energy storage has revealed a bit of the lie of that, because utilities have been able to adapt very quickly to the surge of energy storage. And I think the audio is doing much better now. So if somebody muted, or if maybe I changed the setting, hopefully everybody on the line can hear me a little bit better now. Sorry about that. Let's get into some specific examples, because I really can't overstate how much of a turning point this is in terms of how utilities are valuing energy storage. And this gets into a broader trend of recognizing value for storage. If you can recognize storage as value and you incentivize it properly. If storage has value of X dollars, but you're only paying a developer Y dollars, then it makes it much more complicated and potentially suppresses the amount of energy storage you may see on the grid. So things like FERC Order 821, FERC Order 2222, these are the kinds of things that begin to get at the core of what energy storage can truly do. The PJM effective load carrying capacity conversation, where the energy storage 4-hour effective load carrying capacity is going up from 40% to 80%. 8-hour storage going up from 80% to 95%. This shows that when you really look at this and model it, you can actually reveal that even 4-hour energy storage provides a ton of value right now. And then beyond that, as Dr. Gyuk was getting at, that sort of 8-hour, 10-hour, 100-hour seasonal energy storage creates value as well. And the inflection point between cost and value is where so much of the growth and opportunity in this industry lies. So here's where it's happening for utilities. A great example is in Virginia with Dominion Energy's IRP from 2019 versus 2020. When they submitted their integrated resource plan in 2019, basically the regulators, the legislatures, everybody sent it back to the drawing board. They just passed a relatively aggressive climate forward agenda. And so Dominion, taking that, went back and in a single year, revised their integrated resource plan and had dramatic changes. So for instance, compared to 2019, their next integrated resource plan had a 6x increase in the amount of offshore wind planned, almost a 4x increase in the amount of solar. The amount of energy storage went up by 8x, up to multiple gigawatts of storage. And perhaps most notably, new build natural gas was completely cut from the analysis, which is such a big deal. Instead of having these natural gas plants that are going to be providing what you may think about as capacity or baseload, however you really want to look at that, or even if it's just peaking capacity, we now have renewables and energy storage stepping in and filling that role on the grid. That is what the energy transition is all about. And this is not limited to simply areas where there's been a sort of legislative push in this direction. Let's take a look at Arizona, where we have integrated resource plans in Arizona Public Service from 2017 and Tucson Electric from 2018. They just released their new integrated resource plans in 2020. And you can see here that Arizona Public Services planned energy storage capacity went up by 960%. And Tucson Electric's planned storage capacity went up by a factor of 47. This was a change over just a couple of years, and that reflects the value that energy storage is being recognized for. This is an incredibly big deal, and one of the, I wrote some analysis on the 2017 Arizona Public Service Plan, and at the time, it was remarkably energy storage forward. APS had only 4 megawatts of storage active on the grid, and they were planning on installing another 503 megawatts over the coming years. In just 3 years from that, they have actually increased the amount of storage from there by a factor of nearly 10. What's notable is that 2017 analysis actually included a high case for energy storage, where they examined a portfolio where instead of 500 megawatts, they were looking at about a gigawatt of energy storage. And they found that the 500 megawatt case was more preferable. But as value has been recognized, as costs have declined, as the technology has matured, the offerings and products have matured, now when they look at this, their base case scenario for their integrated resource plan includes almost 5 gigawatts. So their current base case, only 3 years later, is 5 times more than their high case, which they didn't choose 3 years earlier. That's remarkable. That's an incredibly remarkable turning point for the industry and the way that utilities are modeling and valuing energy storage. All of these things come together to result in a forecast that is going to experience exponential growth over the next 5 years. And every time we review the forecast, which is based sort of on a bottoms up, known knowns, active projects, policies, regulations, et cetera, it seems like every quarter there's more active information that causes the forecast to increase. What we're going to wind up seeing is a 2020 where the energy storage industry is likely going to pass a gigawatt for the first time. I say likely, it looks to be the case. Those numbers will be finalized on March 3rd. But then from there, in 2021, there's actually going to be a spike where the market grows almost 3x. So compared to 2019, you're actually seeing a market that's growing in order of magnitude from where it was. The big driver for that, as you can see here, is going to be the front of the meter market, but massive upside for the behind the meter market as well in the out years, where you start seeing more aggregation into wholesale markets, more virtual power plants, more focus on resiliency, whether it's individual resiliency or community resiliency, especially after the events in Texas and last year, California. Of course, that event put into a bit of perspective from the events in Texas as well. These deployments are going to spike dramatically. By 2025, we're going to have about 7.4 gigawatts of energy storage installed annually. The front of the meter space, these large scale systems that are being installed by utilities or independent power producers in wholesale markets, munis, co-ops, et cetera, those will be the lion's share of the market. But I really want to specify that this opportunity is industry-wide and translates to an absolutely massive opportunity for developers, for OEMs, integrators, utilities, you name it. I wanted to focus on a couple of areas here. Obviously, we covered the election in 2020 in deep focus, and it's interesting to see how sort of a divided government will actually function in terms of how clean energy policy is implemented. And then I'll focus on the next slide or in a slide or two about how things are moving at the state level as well. But quickly, in terms of federal action and what we're seeing, what we're actually seeing is what looks to be a divided government in a way. So for those who may not know, of course, the election went to Joe Biden for president, and after runoffs in Georgia, the Senate is now evenly split, 50-50, with the vice president, Kamala Harris, casting the tie-breaking vote. There's actually a razor-thin majority in the Senate. But what we're seeing from even things going on right now in terms of nominations or negotiations on stimulus bills, et cetera, is that the Democrats, when passing policy, even through things like reconciliation or at a simple majority, they can't afford a single defection from their ranks. And their ranks include a number of more moderate Democratic senators from traditionally more red-leaning states. So the idea of a sort of broad Green New Deal style bill, the prospects of that are still very much up in the air. And clearly the government is focused right now on COVID relief, rolling out the vaccine, getting the economy back to something that's closer to business as usual. So beyond the legislative approach, I wanted to focus on what sort of the executive approach can be here. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, personnel as policy. You're going to have leadership at the DOE, EPA, potential shifts at FERC that we're already seeing in terms of how they're implementing or choosing not to follow up on items such as the minimum, the MOPR rule in PJM, buyer side mitigation in New York ISO. This sort of personnel as policy is something that you'll hear from the Washington circles in terms of who you actually put in these positions really frames the conversation. And of course, as we have Dr. Gyuk here, who's obviously not one of these political appointees, very much on the execution side, but very much part of that conversation as well, setting the tone about looking forward, about what that long duration storage requirement is really looking like, and what needs to happen to actually implement that decarbonization agenda. And if I got anything wrong there in terms of the appointments, I apologize there. A second factor is the sort of day one stroke of the pen executive actions. The US is back in the Paris Accord. There's the opportunity to take advantage of fossil fuel infrastructure, which has moved forward with the Keystone XL pipeline. These are relatively impactful things that move beyond the symbolic to some extent. The Paris Agreement still relatively symbolic, but pushing back on the Keystone pipeline, things like that are very climate forward actions that have been taken by this administration. Then, of course, you have the idea of, is there an opportunity for this grand bargain? Compromise in Washington is rarer now. I think we're all aware of that. But when these compromises have happened in the past, it's actually been Biden during the Obama administration who was the chief negotiator with his old colleagues in the Senate. Some examples of what those grand bargains look like. In December 2010, there was a tax compromise which included an extension of tax credits as grants during the recession. So a lot of companies didn't have enough of a tax bill due to the recession to take advantage of the investment or production tax credits. So instead, these became grants for a time in December 2010. That was part of a broader tax compromise that was reached. In April 2021, or sorry, 2012, I believe, the budget deal funded ARPA-E and the EPA, but some of the funding for the energy efficiency and renewable energy funds were slashed. And yes, that was 2012, not in the future here. In January 2012, the wind energy production tax credit passed as part of a fiscal cliff compromise. There is opportunity for federal action in terms of these bargains, these sort of compromises being included as part of a broader negotiation or conversation, whether it's a fiscal cliff, debt ceiling conversation, COVID relief package, as we saw in December, where there was a potentially an opportunity for a standalone storage investment tax credit. That didn't wind up getting into the final bill, but moving forward, as we get to more of these sort of compromises, I believe there absolutely is an opportunity for that to be part of the conversation moving forward. And a standalone storage tax credit would have a dramatic effect on the industry, effectively, based on our analysis, accelerating it by total deployments over the next 5 years by anywhere from 16 to maybe 25%, depending on how much solar paired storage we see moving along, or of course, all of the various elements of how the tax credit is implemented, the timing, the size of it, et cetera. So I would say don't discount anything on the federal side. I'm happy to get into more detail during the Q&A as well. But looking at the state level initiatives, it's been remarkable seeing these state level initiatives. And since this is, of course, the Clean Energy States Alliance, I wanted to highlight some of these that have been incredibly effective in the short, medium, and long term, and some that I think the industry is maybe moving beyond in many respects. A couple of the markets have been very heavily incentivized, and over the short term, those include markets such as California, where we have the self-generation incentive program, which is aimed at distributed energy and now has been the funding has been redirected specifically towards resiliency applications following wildfires, power cutoffs, high temperatures, et cetera. Then for instance, New York, we have the bridge incentive, a real cash incentive boosted at jump-starting the market. In New York, we've had potential approval for now sort of a revenue sharing program to ensure that energy storage is targeted to maximize ratepayer benefits, et cetera. In Massachusetts, we have the SMART program. Basically, storage has made, I think, not just a key component, but I believe it's now mandated as part of the solar initiatives in that market. These are all driving a lot of those deployments that I showed you, not only in the past couple of years, but over the next 2 to 3 years as well. And in the short term, this is going to get a lot of storage onto the grid, where it's going to be providing value, teaching valuable lessons for people in the industry, building out economies of scale. These are incredibly effective policies in the short term, are going to drive applications for storage, bring benefits to the grid, but also accelerate the market. And so, of course, there's an economic component to this as well, where California, New York, Massachusetts, all these other states would like to be leaders in this market to capture some of the clean tech economy and the jobs that would entail. In the midterm, there are sort of looking at maybe the next 5 years, but also the next 10 years and beyond, there's a lot of interesting policies in place. One that I'd really like to highlight is the Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard, one of the first in the country, where it's a targeted approach to incentivize renewables that provide peak energy. So not only looking at, not all electrons are created equal, which a renewable portfolio standard would encourage. Then you have a capacity market saying not all hours are equal. But now we're saying that not all electrons at not all hours are created equal, that there is an incentive during peak periods to bring renewables online. Now, this is kind of an iterative step. If you have a Green New Deal style 100% clean, 100% renewable mandate, you're going to reach 100% renewables or clean energy on the grid anyway. You're going to have that during your peak period since it's 100% in any respect. But this is an iterative step that targets that to periods that are going to bring most value now to ratepayers, to people in the market. Then also just the state level plannings. The Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard built upon the State of Charge report released in 2016. Reports that New Jersey has done. All of these things provide roadmaps and recognize energy storage's value, create more certainty in the market for market participants who may want to come in and actually execute in these markets. Then in the long term, these clean energy targets, of course, are going to require energy storage. I'll dive into that in just a moment. But I think we're sort of moving beyond the time of mandates. Mandates have existed for a while, just simple megawatt or megawatt hour targets in California, Oregon, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York. But now I think we're beyond the point where it's kind of killing a mosquito with a cannon. Energy storage is such a smart resource that targeting it to specific applications, rather than just setting a simple mandate, is much more critical. Mandates still have a place, but right now energy storage is low cost enough and provides enough value that the train is leaving the station, and you sort of don't have to mandate that it do so anymore. You really just have to mandate where it's heading and what value it should be providing, and maybe incentivize it just to move a little bit faster. That's a quick look at what various states are doing. There's going to be more activity at this level, of course, as well, but after the election in 2020, there wasn't much shift in the balance of power in very many states. So it doesn't look like we'll be seeing anything such as what happened in Virginia after the Democrats won control of the legislature and the governorship, and moved quickly on a climate forward agenda. No big swing stories like that in the 2020 election, but of course there's plenty of elections to come as well. A quick look, I'll touch on this briefly on some of the post-COVID scenarios that Wood Mac has started to analyze here. I think it's just an important framework to talk about what happens next. As the vaccine rolls out, as we start trying to get back to business as usual, I think that we will never get back to business as usual, but we'll get into some new normal. But thinking about these things in terms of approaches that not just the US takes, but globally as well, mixing and matching these various approaches is potentially pretty significant. Whether a COVID recovery is quick, that sort of V-shaped recovery as vaccines are implemented, whether a nation or a state chooses that sort of go-it-alone strategy where you're sort of retreating from globalization and focusing on local resources, et cetera, and that could result in pulling back on climate policies. Or if you use the opportunity to focus on greener growth, building out that renewable economy to make that the driver of your recovery moving forward. I want to highlight that these are not mutually exclusive. You could easily see a country, say China, choosing a go-it-alone strategy that focuses on renewable implementation and using that to build out the economy. So moving forward, the economists at Wood Mackenzie are looking at this very quickly. The storage market has weathered the COVID pandemic in the US relatively well. Obviously, sales channels have been affected in the US, and especially on the distributed side, and the non-residential segment hasn't had much growth over the past year. But there's been plenty of opportunities for the front of the meter segment, and residential segment continues to grow. I wanted to highlight a key theme that I think I've been trying to drive home as I've had these conversations, which is this transition from eligibility to opportunity. And then, as Dr. Gyuk mentioned, this transition from opportunity to necessity. Right now, we're in this eligibility phase where we're adapting to new market rules, where utilities are adapting their integrated resource plans, where the other players in the industry, solar, wind, natural gas, are adapting to the new reality of energy storage. And that is why I've tried to highlight this word adaptation, because as we talk about the energy transition, I believe that there's a couple of other words that you can focus on as well. And the first one is adaptation, where these changes happen and the industry needs to adapt to what's happening in the short term. From there, once we have secured eligibility, that's where this energy transition happens in an even more accelerated time frame. And this will be over the next couple of years. This will really move into the opportunity phase. We're going to have reinvestment into the supply chain. We're going to have investment into energy storage as a solution to a myriad of problems on the grid, whether economic or resiliency or implementing policies, et cetera. But then in the next 10, 20 years, depending on various state legislatures, climate agendas, we're going to move into this necessity approach where it's no longer energy storage pushing to have its value recognized in the market, but it's actually the markets that are now pulling energy storage, saying in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish, we need energy storage. This starts happening at those 60, 70, 80% renewables points where it's no longer a question of installing 4 hours of energy storage in the right location and dusting off your hands and going home and mixing yourself a drink. It's now where we start to see that technology that Dr. Gyuk and the DOE is really encouraging, where we start seeing the need for multiple days of storage during low wind events or months of storage to move high wind resource energy into the summer from the winter. There's a huge opportunity here for energy storage to decentralize the market. to truly disrupt the market. What does an energy market look like if all of the resources participating are effectively zero fuel cost resources? There's massive potential for disruption, massive potential for decarbonization, decentralization, and it creates a lot of uncertainty. But I think that one of the things that we do know for certain is that energy storage is going to play a key role, one of the big tools in the toolbox moving forward. So that's all I wanted to cover for now, but I know we left some time, a little bit of extra time at the end for the questions. Sorry for the delay and the technical issues. I appreciate everybody sticking with me. And from there, I'll hand things back over.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan and Imre. This has been a fantastic presentation. We do have lots of questions, and we have plenty of time because we made this an hour and a half webinar. We have until 2:30 East Coast time to get a lot of questions answered and some good discussion going. So, as I said, lots of questions. I want to start with something that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now, which is Texas. And we've had several questions about this. It's something I was planning to ask about in any case. It may be a little early, and I realize that we probably don't have definitive data, but do we know how batteries performed given the situation in Texas? We had extreme low temperatures, gas lines and generators freezing up, wind turbines also having some trouble with ice. Batteries, are they working well at these temperatures? Are they able to provide meaningful resilience over the timescales we're talking about? And do we have any information about how they've worked, and can we learn anything about the opportunities for future use of energy storage?
Absolutely, Todd. I'd be happy to dive in first if you like.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you do that.
Great. Yeah, so it's been a fascinating case study watching what's happened in Texas, and obviously there's so much nuance there. Some of my colleagues on the power side, the short-term power outlook team at Wood Mackenzie, put out a great analysis on sort of an hour by hour what happened in the market, where generators tripped offline and why. I posted that to my LinkedIn, so feel free to follow up with that since they really dive into everything. From an energy storage perspective, the Wood Mackenzie project tracker, where we track energy storage deployments in front of the meter globally, shows that there's 175 megawatts of energy storage operating on the grid in Texas in front of the meter. The majority of that are 1 hour systems. And to put that in perspective, that's about 1/4% of the peak load that was modeled for ERCOT during this weather event a week or two ago. So energy storage really is a drop in the bucket right now. And we don't have a lot of hard information on how these systems performed. Obviously, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to dig into that moving forward. But the preliminary, and I must stress that this is just anecdotal evidence, is for systems where they were still connected to the grid, energy storage performed well. It's worth noting that some of the first energy storage systems installed at large scale in the United States were at remote communities in Alaska. Operating at very cold temperatures is nothing new to energy storage. It just requires planning. And from what I've heard of the market participants down there, energy storage was able to serve that, to actually operate during these extreme cold events. That's the front of the meter side. Then you have the even maybe more vague anecdotal conversation about individual resiliency, people with batteries in their garages or potentially businesses with batteries on site. And some of the things that we've seen is that a lot of people who have solar and storage were able to, no pun intended, weather this a bit more effectively. I've heard stories that people have been able to either simply have uninterrupted power during minor outages, rolling blackouts, to people who have claimed that their storage systems really, combined with on-site solar and connected directly to the storage, bailed them out and was able to keep their power going throughout most of the event. I think we'll need to do a lot more analysis on this, a lot more look in terms of how much storage is really capable of providing that when paired with solar, because if you have a 3-day outage event in a 2-hour battery, it seems like that's not a solution to the problem. And in many respects, it isn't. But if you have on-site solar and you're able to run a reduced load, maybe just your refrigerator, your internet, a couple of lights and some heating, maybe that's enough to actually get through these. Or maybe if prices drop a little bit more, it becomes an opportunity to do so. We've already seen a surge in interest from Texas, just from installers, people selling generators and storage systems, a surge of interest in solar and storage in the market, and that's going to spread well beyond Texas. So anticipate a big surge in terms of the number of people looking at energy storage for resiliency on the residential side. And then tying that back to the front of the meter side, if you have a grid that's lost 30 gigawatts of resources and has lost them for multiple days, for storage to be a panacea for that, you really need that storage to have 70, 80, 90 hours of duration and then 30 gigawatts of capacity. That is an amount of energy storage that is staggering, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more than is on the grid today. That requires a manufacturing uplift that is absolutely staggering from a gigawatt hour perspective, and probably new technologies as well, long duration technologies that scale better with duration. None of that really exists at a commercial scale yet today, but if storage wants to come in and firm out these long-term outages or just smooth out spikes in demand and supply, then we're going to have to start having that conversation of how we build out manufacturing and economic capability for these long duration systems. And Dr. Gyuk, I know that you can probably speak much more in depth on that topic.
Well, to add to your point, ERCOT, of course, is an electrical island. It cannot really supplement its generation from the outside. And they have resisted this connection to the outside strenuously for decades. Texas also has the lowest capacity margin. They are at 6%. And what 6% will do for you is exactly what happened during the outages when the wind turbines froze up. Texas has been very happy to adopt wind energy, in particular because it's good business, but they have not really paid attention to the corollary of needing massive amounts of energy storage or other capacity reserves. And as we move towards renewables, those capacity reserves will increasingly have to be storage. And to bring that about, as Dan just said, we will need massive revolutions in manufacturing, in supply chain, in all kinds of things.
Great. I'm going to get to a supply chain question in a minute, but I want to follow up on this question of resiliency and outages. We've had, of course, similar experiences all over the place. I mean, we have wildfire-related outages in California, hurricane-related outages on the East Coast. Here in Vermont, in October of 2019, and Dan, I believe you guys reported on this at the time, there was an outage to 115,000 customers, and Green Mountain Power had put batteries into a lot of residential customers, behind the meter into homes through one of their programs, and over 1,000 homes that had batteries were able to keep the lights on an average for 9 hours during that extended outage, and power through it. Now, I'm kind of leading up to a question here because it's behind the meter in a heated environment. Obviously, you can have a climate control system. What about when the batteries are located outside of the structure or in a shipping container or something of that nature, in extreme cold temperatures? And we've had some experience, I think, in other cold climates like Alaska. How do they perform? Is it a matter of the chemistry you've selected, and is there a need for climate controls to ensure that batteries are kept within a certain range of temperatures, or do they do well? What's the capacity cost or the efficiency cost at extreme low temperatures?
Well, there are several things there. First of all, if the temperature goes too low, the battery will simply quit. I found that to my amazement when I was in Manchuria in minus 15 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, and my iPhone just quit. Hadn't expected that, but should have from a scientific point of view. But outside of the ordinary range of temperatures, and this is both high temperatures and low temperatures, the efficiency of lithium-ion batteries is reduced. And so you will not be able to realize your theoretical efficiency. You will need to discount that considerably. Unless you have basically air conditioning. And the cost of air conditioning, heating in particular if you have a cold temperature, but cooling if you are in a warmish temperature, should be accounted when you talk about the overall effectiveness and efficiency of lithium-ion batteries. And frequently it isn't. There are all kinds of costs which you don't really ever find out about unless you're actually doing it.
Yep, it really does all come down to cost, where there are batteries installed for these applications going on today in places like Minnesota or in Vermont, where it gets quite cold, as you well know, Todd. And it's all about actually just planning for that and implementing the costs and the temperature controls to keep the battery at the right temperature, potentially making it a bit more expensive. But if you're installing a system there, then that's really the only option. So it becomes more of a cost question rather than a technology question, as Dr. Gyuk was getting at. And that really becomes the biggest question because it's so hard to put a dollar value on resiliency. How much would you pay to have your power not go out during an outage event? How much would you pay for having 2 hours of backup to charge your phones versus maybe 2 days worth of backup or indefinite backup with an on-site generator? How much would you pay to have that backup power be charged from on-site solar so that it's clean energy and you're not doing some sort of fossil fuel generation as well? Those are very hard questions to answer because it depends on the individual value of a person or a family. Well, how many groceries do I have in my refrigerator? Do I need to do work from home and I need electricity and the internet to do that? Am I keeping my heating or air conditioning on so that my home is livable? It's so hard to put a dollar value on those things. So it's still very much an emotional conversation. But given what we saw in Texas and the incredible hardships that communities experienced, I think that the value conversation on resiliency is going to be shifting quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. I want to
And of
try
course,
to get
Texas,
to a number of these.
second.
Yeah, go ahead, Imre.
And of course, Texas also showed some extreme examples of lack of social equity. I mean, there are many stories there of people who were charged exorbitant rates, although they were not able to afford them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and in general,
it's a key conversation
seen that
when implementing incentives as well. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in general, we've seen that natural disasters and the associated power outages tend to hit underserved communities and low-income communities hardest for various reasons. And they are typically less able to easily rebound from those disasters. But I do want to move on. We have a lot of other questions. So one is regarding, as I said before, global supply chains related to energy storage. With regard to the global pandemic and also trade tensions between the US and China, who's tracking the global supply chain for storage, and what are we looking at for the coming years, or year perhaps, given the situation?
Well, have you heard about the energy storage subscription service offered at a reasonable price by Wood Mackenzie? Sorry, couldn't help myself. Yeah, we absolutely do track that in a lot of detail because the supply chain is so critical to how we're seeing prices, which affects what storage opportunities are going to be economical, and that affects what, how many deployments we're going to be seeing moving forward. We track all lithium-ion manufacturing capacity globally, and all planned capacity as well. So through the pipeline, where I think we have about 1,600 gigawatt hours of announced capacity through 2030, and of course that number will probably increase as capacity comes online. But we actually just put out a report last week on the lithium-ion supply crunch, and without getting into too many spoilers, effectively it's this ongoing conversation, ongoing friction between the EV market and the stationary storage market. As we've seen the EV market take off as well, there's a question, if you're a manufacturer, of where do you supply, who do you provide your supply for lithium-ion batteries? If the EV market is potentially a bit higher margin, do you redirect some of your supply there? And then how much does that affect the stationary storage market? That's going to be absolutely a critical question, and may put some supply constraints and then pricing constraints on how quickly prices are falling here in the US. A lot of system integrators, product designers have longer term contracts for storage. Others who may be trying to get into the game right now may find that prices are not going to be as low as potentially anticipated because of this duality in the market. It's a fascinating juxtaposition between the benefits of having a technology that shares a parallel market, in this case the electric vehicle market, and then the pitfalls of that. Of course, the storage market has benefited from the tremendous declines in lithium-ion batteries, driven by the scale of the global EV demand. But at the same time now, as EV demand continues to skyrocket, if manufacturing can't keep up, the stationary storage market may find itself not accelerating as quickly as it otherwise could. So we do have some analysis on that. That's just come out in the past couple of weeks as well.
Well, that's great, because I was going to ask you about EVs, and a couple of people have asked. There's kind of two different sides, ways to look at this story, right? So one is as the EV market grows and the cars start to age out, those EV batteries can be repurposed for stationary storage, and often, even though they are not, they're no longer sufficient for transportation use, they may be quite useful for stationary storage purposes. So is there any significant, I guess, on a commercial scale, any significant movement to repurpose EV batteries? And on the other side of the coin, as you mentioned, is the expansion of EV markets, electric vehicle, for those of you who may be wondering what we're talking about, possibly going to create some kind of a bottleneck, in the sense that it may suck up all the available manufacturing capacity, leaving stationary storage markets at a bit of a loss to fill orders. Do you have any sense of this?
Well, there is one thing I want to remark, and that is, we are not just talking about electrification of transportation with electric vehicles. We are talking about electrification in general. Manufacturing, ports, ferries, airplanes even. We're going to see a world where just about everything is electrified and taken out of carbonization. On the one hand, that will take tremendous amounts of storage, stationary storage, but on the other hand, it's also going to use batteries directly in the electrification process, such as electric vehicles. So it's definitely a problem we have to tackle. We can't have those two streams in opposition. They have to work together. You cannot have extensive vehicle electrification without having the stationary background, unless we go to nuclear or something like that.
There is tremendous opportunity for second life applications for stationary storage. If something's not suited for an EV anymore, you've driven it into the ground. Now stick it on the ground and then run it into the ground even further, as it provides power applications. The only question is the time frame for it, really, and that becomes a big question because you're not just talking about the ramp up of second life battery applications, business models, etc. But first you have to have the ramp up of EVs, and then you have to wait until those EVs start running out of, when the batteries in those EVs start wearing down, which could take a long time. The batteries are getting increasingly better. They have better degradation, and of course the mileage keeps improving, the energy density keeps improving. So, if you can get up to a 1,000 mile battery that every time and then has a 1,000 cycle lifetime, then that's a 1,000,000 mile car. How long is it going to take for that 1,000,000 mile car to not need that battery anymore and get it into the second life market? So I think it's a tremendous opportunity, but it requires two scale ups. You have to scale up the amount of EVs in the market, and then you have to scale up how those EVs are retiring their own batteries. And then you have to scale, I guess a third one, you then have to scale up the second life market as well. But that there's investment going into that opportunity. There's investment, of course, going into recycling as well, decarbonization of the supply chain as well. All of these pieces do fit together, but we still are, we need to have the manufacturing ramp up before we start really talking seriously about the second life ramp up.
Well, this brings up another question from one of our listeners in the webinar, which is, will reuse or recycling dominate? I know that for recycling, for example, we have well-established recycling for lead acid batteries, for example, where the components can be recycled economically. And as Dr. Gyuk pointed out earlier, any kind of reuse or recycling regime needs to be economic, or nobody is going to do it. And we've seen in other examples of other commodities, for example, the old television CRTs, cathode ray tube TVs, that when they got replaced with flat screens, the market for recycling that glass just kind of evaporated overnight, and now we have these huge stockpiles of the old style TVs that nobody can economically do anything with at the moment. What are we looking at, do you think? Reuse or recycling or some combination? Where is this going for EV batteries?
At the moment, there is no economic way of either reuse or recycling in any large scale. You can do it on the small scale. There are a few manufacturers who do it. There's a lot of research going on. Argonne, for example, has a lithium-ion recycling research institute or effort going on. Other national labs are working on it too. But in terms of a going economic concern, we really don't have anything. Prove me wrong, Dan, if you can.
I cannot prove you wrong. You're absolutely right. It comes down to getting a solution that is proved on a technical scale, but then having that technical solution be proven at a commercial scale. And those are two areas where I still think there are plenty of hurdles in the first one, in the ongoing research efforts being led by some of the great labs and great minds here in the US and elsewhere on how to recycle, how to reuse these, but we're not there yet, you know? As the market gets bigger and bigger, as the demand increases, as maybe political and cultural winds shift, and we look at the supply chains more, we look at what is the sort of footprint of our activities more. Maybe there is an acceleration in how soon we look at this question of reuse versus recycling. But for now, it's kind of a twinkle in our eye. The market, as I said, is still at the cusp of accelerating. And so it's really hard to envision what happens to these batteries 20 years from now, when it's hard to know what the reality is going to look like then. So I think there will be plenty of reuse. I think there will be plenty of recycling opportunities, but then what is the most commercially viable opportunity? I'm afraid I don't have anything to contradict you, Dr. Gyuk.
I was hoping you would.
I'm sure there are plenty of people on the call right now who are working on this very rapidly, and we'll be hearing about their solutions. And 20 years from now, they'll have saved the market, and I look forward to being surprised then.
Likewise.
Well, thank you for the discussion on that. I wanted to circle back to this issue of longer duration storage. It seems as though, and you had a nice slide, Dan, that showed sort of the booms in the storage industry in the U.S. over the years, and there was the PJM frequency regulation market, which was based on very, very short. Looking at response times in seconds or fractions of seconds, and duration needed for that was fairly short. Then we have, and then that got saturated, that market. Then we have a kind of widespread demand management or demand response market, where you're looking at the need for maybe a 3 or 4 hour response to serve regional demand peaks. Notably in Massachusetts, the Clean Peak Standard, I think and the Connected Solutions Program, I think in both cases they're looking at, on average a 3 hour response from the batteries enrolled in those programs. So that's slightly longer term. And resiliency, of course, people are looking for a little bit more than an hour or two. Maybe they want a day. And then when you start looking down the road into really long term, are we talking about storage for wind, for example, which goes in much longer cycles? And so the question is, how do you get an economic use out of long-term storage, given the low usage rate you would assume? In other words, if you're charging and discharging every few minutes or few hours, or even every day or two, that's one thing. But if you're charging and discharging over a scale of days or weeks or months, how do you get enough use out of that battery to make it economic? And is that really where this industry needs to go? And how do you envision that being an economic use for storage? I realize this is kind of a pie in the sky question, but
I'm a pie in the sky guy, so I don't mind at all. So I have to get my bucket of cold water ready first, but then hopefully I'll, as my answer moves on, people won't feel as disappointed. In the next 5 years, there simply will not be significant need for more than 4 hours of energy storage. Energy storage applications for resiliency may be longer duration, but in those applications for economics, a generator is still going to win out over stationary storage due to its energy limited potential. There will be plenty of people still using storage, but it won't be these 8 hour, 10 hour, 40 hour, 100 hour systems. even then, when we do have these limited niche applications for 8-hour systems like we saw on Nantucket, where instead of running a transmission line to the island off the coast of Massachusetts, or replacing or upgrading diesel generation that's on site, they installed a battery storage system that was 8 hours in duration, and they chose a lithium-ion system simply because it outcompeted any of these longer duration technologies, because lithium-ion not only has a head start because of the economics of scale of the EV market, it's still reducing its cost. So if you have a novel technology that maybe is a flow battery, you're not going to put that onto a car. How do you actually scale up from there? And that's actively happening. There's massive investment going on in this, but it's not going to be in the next 5 years. In the next 10 years, things start to get a bit more interesting. I'll focus on 2 areas where we've actually seen the first true rumblings of long duration storage. And in this case, just 10 hours or so for now. The first is in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai. KIUC is planning a combination pumped hydro, long duration, I believe, lithium ion system and solar, which will provide 25% of the island's electricity and move them to 80% renewables. That is a large scale pumped hydro system that is going to be, in order to get them past that hump up to that 80% renewable penetration. In California, the CPUC has identified a need for about 1 gigawatt of long duration storage. In this case, I think, again, it's 8 or 10 hours by 2026. Again, looking at it technology agnostic, but I think they've identified the potential for pumped hydro there as well. These are sort of canaries in the coal mine for what long duration storage we're going to need as we get into higher renewable penetrations. I always think about, it depends on the market, right? For a market that's heavy with solar power, solar is a bit more predictable than wind. Of course, you have cloudy days and sunny days, but you generally know that you're not going to have any solar at 2 a.m. and that you will have some solar at 2 p.m. And of course, that varies by geography, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a bit more predictable. So you can focus more on 4, 10, 12 hours of energy storage to shift storage day to day. For areas where there's high wind penetration, you kind of have to account for periods where there's a week or multiple weeks without a whole lot of wind. And so you need to shift more than 10 hours, maybe up to 100, 150 hours of storage. It becomes much more complex question, much more expensive as well. So what I like to think about is the duration of storage needed evolving. And the sort of duration needed corresponds quite well to how much renewables you have on the grid. That's why KIUC and California are sort of the canaries here, because KIUC, this system is going to get them up to 80% renewables. That's a staggering amount compared to any other market in the United States for variable renewable penetration, or just raw renewable penetration. In California, the same, very much climate forward, renewables forward. There's going to be a need for long duration storage there dramatically. And then as other markets move towards 100% renewables, then that long duration storage, that's the necessity conversation I told you about, where you need that long amount of storage. And now, instead of building lithium ion systems, you could build a lithium ion battery that has 100 hours of storage. It would just be super expensive, because every time you double the duration, you're effectively taking the same number of cabinets or containers and plopping them down next to the first one, and then doubling it again and doubling it again. If you have a technology that scales better than that, it can start out competing lithium ion at 8 hours, at 100 hours, at 150 hours. And then once it becomes economically viable, once it becomes commercial, of course, thanks to the work that all of these technology providers in the DOE are doing, then it starts out competing lithium ion, and you start having these other technologies playing a huge role. One of the big pitfalls of this, though, is, as I mentioned on KIUC, this system gets them up to 80%. Getting from 80% renewables to 100% renewables is probably a lot harder than getting to 80% renewables, simply because you're taking out getting that last step, those last long duration storage technologies, moving that last bit of renewables, overbuilding renewables, it gets more expensive. So what happens in these markets if a state legislature looks at an 80%, 90% renewables grid, looks at the price point of getting up to 100% and says, well, what if we create offsets in some other part of the economy? Or what if we do something else to mitigate that last 10% rather than investing this much in long duration storage? That's something I worry about in terms of the economic capabilities of these technologies. So In the next 5 years, there won't be any long duration storage or very little. Pilot programs, proof of concept, absolutely. But at scale, there simply isn't a need for it in the US yet. Out to 2030, you're going to start seeing long duration storage be playing a big factor on the grid. And then potentially in the mid 2030s, I think you could make a case for saying that on a megawatt hour basis, long duration storage could be the majority of storage installed on the grid if the economic and cultural will to implement large amounts of renewables remains moving forward. But that, of course, depends on the technologies maturing to a point where they're commercial, which is, of course, the great work that's being done by many of the people on the webinar here, and then, of course, at the DOE as well. Sorry, a bit of a rambling response, but it's a big question, and I really can't stop myself once again talking about it because it's so fascinating and so complex.
Imre, do you want to chime in?
Yeah.
Or
I agree with you completely on the time scale. But I do want to remind people that there is a long duration storage, which is very popular. It's pumped hydro. And we developed that when we needed it to make nuclear power respond to the load. And the way, what I can see in terms of long duration storage as the most feasible one, I mean, large scale long duration storage, is hybrid systems, where you use assets like pumped hydro, but then you run the short term with batteries. There are other things. There is compressed air, of course, which we have a few examples that work very well, but there could be more. And we have other examples of gravity storage, which could be very cost effective. In fact, dirt cheap, because you might be just moving gravel up a hill and back down again and harvesting the potential energy. The main thing is, can we afford to have stranded assets of that magnitude economically? And the other question is this going to be involve a vast footprint? Because the cheaper the technology is, the bigger the footprint is going to be, except for the things like underground storage. So I can see lots of problems, but luckily we do have some time to get ready for it. But we should not lose track of the fact that we will need it.
That's such a great point. And bringing up pumped hydro is so critical because there was actually a federal preliminary approval for a system by the old Navajo coal generating plant up in Utah, using that existing transmission capacity, building a pumped storage system to provide electricity to Arizona, Nevada, and even California, long duration storage there. But of course, the geography is limited, and you bring up this footprint question. Are you going to be building these giant towers of Jenga blocks through the Midwest or in a city? Are you going to run out of places where you can build pumped hydro? Moving forward, what does it mean for pumped hydro being built as this system is going to be on the Colorado River with the thorny water issues that are, of course, trickling through to the rest of the market there? That's why I love this question so much. It's so complicated, it's so complex, and I think there are going to be multiple different solutions that are available in different geologies or different durations, or where different levels of efficiency are required, round trip efficiency. I don't think there's ever going to be just one solution in the same way that we're seeing lithium ion dominate the market now. We're going to see a true diversity of solutions, which I'm incredibly excited about.
There are also thermal technologies that are in play here, things like liquefied air and various phase change materials and so on. All of them being explored, all of them perhaps moving towards economical feasibility.
And all of them, presumably, will be discussed or at least touched upon during your long duration storage workshops in March 9th and 10th. So we'll send out further information about those two STAP. Those of you who have signed up for the STAP mailing list, as we have the information, we'll send it. Those of you who haven't signed up, feel free to do so. We're at the end of our time here. So thank you so much to Dr. Imre Gyuk of DOE and Dan Finn-Foley of Wood Mackenzie for your insights. And we've already talked about upcoming webinars, but Samantha put that back up. And thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. A pleasure as always.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Gyuk. Thank you, CISA team. Thanks everybody for joining.